Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss something which came up in the stream last Saturday about the interesting and very challenging strategic situation the Lib Dems find themselves in. Because in order to consolidate or even build on their success from the general election last month, they have a much trickier set of problems to solve than either Labour or the Conservatives, or indeed other political parties really. But first, I must just point out, so if any major news has broken today, and you're wondering why I'm not talking about that, it's because I'm actually out getting married. In fact, at the time this video is published, I will be currently trying to plot my escape from the festivities, without success, I'm sure, because I gather that as the groom, I'm not allowed an early exit. Never mind. However, as I'm pretty sure I've discussed in the past, I chose the date for the wedding specifically because it's a completely dead term in terms of like political news. So I think I should be safe, but just in case. But anyway, the Lib Dems, as I was saying last Saturday, they have a somewhat unique challenge in terms of building on their success this year. Like for Labour and the Conservatives, the strategy can be based on a relatively simple premise. They each need to persuade voters that they are the best prospect in government. You know, how you do that can be more difficult, but the basics are simple enough. For most other opposition parties, you just have to be a big voice in Parliament opposing whichever of those parties is in government. But the Lib Dems have a more difficult premise. In fact, there are a couple of elements to it. First of all, voters are not going to believe they can win enough seats to form a government. So the Lib Dems cannot base their strategy on the argument that they could form a government. That would just fail, it wouldn't work. If the polls suggest the possibility of a hung Parliament, then being the junior partner in a coalition comes into play. But they are so badly burned from their experience from Cameron and Osborne, then you wouldn't imagine them wanting to push that idea too strongly either. And then there's another problem as well. People ideally don't want a hung Parliament. So that actually would encourage them, if they thought the Conservatives could, with enough votes, form a majority government, persuade them to vote Conservative. Which brings me on to another issue anyway. So you think to yourself, what value can the Lib Dem offer their voters if they are basically saying to their voters, vote for us, we are going to be in opposition, right? Has to be their voice in Parliament on issues that neither the big two will champion, but that can apply to other parties. There are enough policy areas for the Lib Dems to be able to do that, certainly. But how valuable is that voice if it's not heard? Surely it has to be a voice that can make changes. Which brings me on to that second challenge they have. In theory, it shouldn't matter to the Lib Dems who forms the government, Labour or the Conservatives, just like it doesn't for other parties like the Greens or the SNP, for example. But it does. If you look at the seats the Lib Dems gained, from whom did they gain them? They didn't gain some from the Conservatives and some from Labour and some from here and some from there. They're basically from the Conservatives. Remember, the reason the Tories won a majority in 2015 wasn't because voters were all terribly pleased with austerity and wanted to reward Cameron with a load of extra votes. No, he didn't get really very many extra votes. What happened was that the Lib Dem voters were furious at austerity and abandoned the Lib Dems in huge numbers. And, well, in those seats, the Conservatives were in second place. So do you know what happened? The result was a loss of Lib Dem support, and those Tory candidates won by being dint of the fact that most of everyone else votes Conservative in those areas. The Tories benefited from Lib Dem voters just voting for an unrealistic third option or not voting at all. Basically, the Lib Dems need Labour to be winning elections in order for them to win lots of seats themselves, because if voters decide that Labour should no longer be in government, they'll flip their vote to the Conservatives, who are the alternative. And because Lib Dem seats are almost exclusively in competition with the Tories, that would cost the Lib Dems loads of seats as well, which is why they have this unique problem. What the Lib Dems effectively need to do is hold a position that Labour are the better option for government, but that the Lib Dems are a better opposition to that Labour government than the Tories would be. And how to do that? They can't simply be a bigger voice than the Tories, saying more things that people will stroke their chins and go, yes, I agree with that. The media will happily present Tory talking points, but they completely ignore the Lib Dems, which is why I say it would have been a game changer if the Tories were beaten into third place in the election. The broadcast media in particular would be forced to platform the Lib Dems on a regular basis. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. So now you don't even know what the Lib Dems have been up to for the past 2 months, do you? No, because nobody in the mainstream media is talking about it. So the Lib Dems will never be seen by the general public as leading the opposition against Labour. And in point of fact, they want to be careful about how they do that anyway, because of the aforementioned need for Labour to remain in power. So what they're going to need to do is show that they can effect change from the opposition benches. To be able to claim that they have nudged Labour into better policy, in order to say, yeah, this is better than the Tories, absolutely better than the Tories, no problem there. But it's not quite good enough, you know. So we're going to show them how they can make it even better. Take the rough edges off, if you like, which is tricky because a government with a substantial majority doesn't need to listen to what the opposition wants. Now, sure, Labour are building up various structures specifically to give opposition MPs more of a say. Starmer's, talking about he wants cross-party support on things. But ultimately, Labour have the numbers in Parliament to do things their way whenever they want. However, you could argue that there could be a bit of symbiosis here, that it is also in Labour's interest for the Lib Dems to claim a few wins, because Labour are not really in competition with the Lib Dems anywhere. It's like one place in Sheffield. In order for the Tories to come back to power, yes, they're going to have to take a lot of seats back from Labour, but they're also going to have to take dozens of seats back from the Lib Dems. If the Lib Dems look strong in those seats, then the Conservatives will not look like they've got a path back to government, even if they think they can take some of those Labour seats. And they would be effectively asking voters to produce a hung parliament. At which point, Labour just used the argument the Tories have been using for the last decade. We're the only party who can form a stable government. They might even use Cameron's line against them with more credibility this time. Do you want chaos with the Tories? And they can talk about how they would be in the pockets of Nigel Farage and Reform UK. You know, they can use exactly the same shtick. So it helps Labour if the Lib Dems remain strong in those Tory Lib Dem areas that Labour can't win anyway. These areas tend to be quite rural. And as luck would have it, although the mainstream media haven't been talking about what the Lib Dems have been up to, I've been trying to have a look. And the Lib Dems are going to be chairing the Rural Affairs Select Committee. Now, Labour also did very well in rural areas against the Tories this year. So what the Lib Dems will ideally want is to be seen to be acting sort of as constructively critical partners with Labour in order to improve things in rural parts of the country. If they can work with Labour like that, it could highlight two things. First, they can highlight that Labour are better in government than the Conservatives, because they could say, well, they're making these improvements, right? And we wouldn't have got these improvements with the Conservatives because they just wouldn't listen. That obviously helps Labour if they can paint Labour as being effectively better. But it also helps the Lib Dems because then those voters have no reason to flip back to the Tories in those Lib Dem seats. But second, the Lib Dems are able to give a steer on rural policies, which means the outcomes should be better than if it was just Labour driving them. The chair of the Rural Affairs Select Committee will help them do this. And as I say, it might make sense for Labour to let the Lib Dems be seen to nudge them in a few areas. It's not to say that will happen. You know, lots of policymakers and advisors in both parties are annoyingly tribal. But there would be common benefit. But it still represents a tough challenge for the Lib Dems. They can't convince their voters that they have a chance of forming a government, unlike the Tories. So they have to cancel out that Conservative advantage by not letting voters think a Conservative government's a good idea, which by default means saying we need to keep Labour in power. But they also have to be seen as a more useful choice in opposition with zero media support and without being able to attack the current government in the same way the Tories will, because they don't want the current government to be seen as unsuitable. They just need people to see them in need of nudges of the sort only the Lib Dems can provide. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe for further content and click the like button. You can also sign up for memberships if you'd like to support the channel further. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.